do anything about it. It's just going to grab you. So all of these phenomena, I think, revolve around the idea of focused attention. It's where you put your attention. Yes?
It seems that to define something as precognitive requires a rather narrow definition of the event. So the presentation of images, if you expand the sense, it's a larger energy field or informational field. So
It's any random event. You can think of it as, in the quantum mechanical terms, as fundamentally random, and of course Einstein didn't like that, and maybe he was right. Maybe what looks like it's random is actually the result of everything else going around in the rest of the universe. So one of my colleagues likes to think of a random number generator as the pivot upon which the universe turns. So any given random event might well be a result of everything else. And if you had access to everything else, which I think we do, then you could know. You could know almost in a deterministic way, but you'd need to access all of the information in the entire universe at this time. So that's too big for my head. Yes?
Maybe would you say for everybody in general, meditation is just being still into access to them in general?
Yeah, the single method that seems to work best for most people is meditation, because all of these phenomena have to do with being able to access what's going on inside your head. And so, in a sense, what the phenomena say is that, as the yogis say, that what's going on inside your head is the universe. That there is some deep relationship, maybe an identical relationship between Atman and Brahman. That's what these phenomena look like. I don't want us to get too distracted by all of this, so precognition is interesting because we're really moving towards the survival evidence. So the reason I brought up this is because it's one of the classes of psychic phenomena, but also that our sense of how things are in our everyday way of thinking about it is not completely right. We're connected in space and we're also connected in time. And the time element makes the understanding of the survival evidence even more problematic than it would be otherwise. Because now, if a medium is talking to your dead relative, maybe that is actually happening when the person is alive, but just in the past. You see, so you have to think of that. Telepathy is not limited to present time, in other words. So there have been 22 presentiment studies of this type, lots of different versions. The two that I think are most interesting are one that was done using worms and the one that most recently done using birds. So what this says is that this is not a special human ability. This seems to be, again, something to do with sentience, that we have the ability to sense through space and time. These were finches, Bengalese finches. Psychokinesis. Why does the spoon bend? Exactly. Why does the spoon bend? Because there is no spoon, at least not in the Matrix. This is Nina Kolagina, a famous Russian psychic, moving little objects inside a glass box. And this is the way it's done at the Princeton University Engineering Anomalies Lab, using things like balls, thousands of balls falling through this apparatus, and lots of other methods. Let's see if this clip comes up. This is my PK clip. Including the dice tossing experiments, which is you have a die, you toss it, and you wish to get a certain number. There are the die. It's gone through probably 20 years of advancement. Like, you don't want to use a die like you'd get in a game because they're not precisely balanced. You want to use the type that they use in casinos, which are are balanced exactly the same on each side. And you don't want to use your hand to toss it because there are ways of faking it, so use a machine and so on. This shows J.B. Rhine, his apparatus used back in the 30s and 40s to do dice studies. It started as a result of a gambler who claimed that he could influence the dice. So there were a lot of studies done based on this from 1935 to 1987 mostly. Lots and lots of studies, lots of people, lots of dice being thrown. And the overall odds against chance is an untrigintillion, which is 10 to the 96 to 1. Trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions to 1 against chance. So there's pretty good evidence that some people, sometimes, can influence the dice to land the way that they wish. The dice studies are in yellow, so these sort of petered out by the early 80s, and they were taken over to a large extent by electronic random number generators. So for electronic generators, they basically are these little boxes. They're based on radioactive decay or electronic noise. Lots and lots of publications, lots of investigators, lots of studies. The original meta-analysis was 1989. I updated it twice. And basically, an electronic generator is producing noise, just like this. And you sample it, and you can create zeros and ones randomly. And the idea is that you get a sequence of zeros and ones, which creates a random walk. And you ask somebody then to, rather than making it go randomly, to try to push it to aim high. And if you're lucky, you'll get a result that looks like that. It goes high. So this is the result of 12 years of studies using this method at Princeton. And if you're aiming high, it goes high. If you're aiming for baseline, sort of in the middle. And if you're aiming low, it goes low. The difference between the high and low statistically is very, very strong. Yes?
Is this real time or is this...
This is all real time. Yeah, these are all real time experiments. So there's their paper, lots of subjects, 12 years of people. This is all from one laboratory, though. So when you look at all of the labs, I found 600 experiments. I'm not going to go through the details on this. It's in my books. The bottom line is that the odds against chance are 50,000 to 1. So it's not like the trillions and trillions and trillions that we see with some of the other phenomena, but it does suggest that electronic random generators can be pushed by intention a little bit. So the overall assessment for psi is this then, that there's now 128 years of laboratory tests. Psi phenomena were studied for probably 30 to 40 years before that. But in the laboratory, 128 years. The laboratory has a disadvantage of constraining the phenomena we're looking at. By its very nature, we're controlling all kinds of things, which was going to reduce what happens in the real world. So people's psychic experiences are much more exciting than the stuff that I just presented. It's real exciting for scientists. I get very excited when I see data like this, because I have higher confidence that it's real, which is not to say that our experiences are certainly real too. It's just hard to convey it to somebody else. You know that if you have a synchronicity which is meaningful to you and you tell the synchronicity to somebody else, well, their hair doesn't stand up because it was meaningful for you. Well, it's kind of the same this way. So this is mostly based on the general population. These are not people making special claims. We see effects, and they're rather small, but they're true for everyone. When we use talented populations, or we specifically pull out from the population people who are in high creative professions, like writers, dancers, artists, and so on, you get much higher effect sizes. And when we ask those people about their belief in these phenomena, you get much, much higher levels of belief. And so what this says is that in that case, belief is driven not by fantasy, but by their actual experience. They believe because it happens to them, not because they're just more fantasy prone. So we see repeatable effects. Among the informed skeptics, which is a small subset of skeptics, they admit that there's no plausible alternatives to the psi hypothesis. So the data is pretty good. Whoop. And now we have to have a rest. Our light bulb needs a rest. So the bottom line of all of this psi research is that the idea that you are your brain and that's all is probably wrong. That our mind has capabilities that don't seem to be admitted very well by a physical object in the brain. Unless the brain, as we think of it as a material object, is not all it appears to be either. So up until the development of quantum mechanics, it was basically impossible. Psi was impossible because there was no way for anything to get into your head other than through the ordinary senses. With quantum theory, now there's a whole new ballgame because matter is not what we thought it was either. Even matter is distributed everywhere. So it's conceivable that your brain is largely here, but there are elements of it which could be distributed in the universe as well. So it still may be the case that your mind and brain are kind of the same thing, except that if your brain is distributed, then your mind has to be distributed too. This muddies the waters for understanding survival, because now it means that your brain, literally your brain, may actually have access to everything in space and time. In which case, if a medium says they're talking to a dead person, well, they may actually be talking to them, but it's because they were alive 50 years ago and not now. So that's why, rather than psi making the evidence clearer, it actually makes it a little bit more difficult, especially when you stir in a little bit of quantum mechanics into it. Yeah. You. Search the people who claim that they changed the past. Most of the time I don't work with people with special claims. Occasionally I do. But the reason I don't is because it's not necessary. We can choose. The IONS campus is typically where I do this, and then it takes a bit of a pilgrimage to get there. So by the time somebody shows up in the laboratory, they're already very highly self-selected. We don't get people who aren't interested, and we don't get highly skeptical people. We get people who are coming in because they think they have something. So in that sense, it's selected, but we don't go out and look for people who claim to have high talent. In fact, I usually avoid people who claim high talent because they have more to lose. If the experiment doesn't work, and they think they're very psychic, they're going to go away disappointed, and I don't want to disappoint them. And in addition, as I said, when we do an experiment in the lab, it's extremely constrained. It may not be what the person's good at. So if I brought in the world's best high jumper into the lab and asked them to do something psychic, they would say, well, that's not what I do. And that's a legitimate concern. So I tend to take people who are interested, but not necessarily psychic. Yes.
Where does astral travel and dreamwalking fit into all this?
Astral travel and dreamwalking. I think that the ideas, the concepts of astral travel comes out of people's experience. So their experiences that they somehow left in a body and they went somewhere. There have been a couple of experiments on out-of-body states, and there's an inkling of evidence that they are actually there. But it's, as you can imagine, it's a very subjective phenomenon. It's very difficult to test using existing scientific methods. So as a scientist, I don't have much of an opinion on it. I have good friends who are exceptionally psychic, like Joe McMoneagle, who claims that he can do remote viewing, which he somehow projects out, or he can go there. So he makes the discrimination. To him, there's a subjective difference between getting the information and going there literally to get it. So I have to take his word for it that there's some difference, but we don't know how to measure it yet. Let's see, are we back? Maybe. Yeah, it's now properly cooled. This happens, by the way, whenever, especially on precognition. When I start talking about precognition and the evidence for it, and people start thinking about it, you get a peculiar headache in the corpus callosum, which is the portion of the brain that connects the two hemispheres, and you get this really weird headache in the middle of your head when you try to think about it, because it's really difficult to think about. So maybe that's what happened to the projector. Dave, just stop it. So there are challenges to the brain equals mind assumption, and at the very bottom, absolutely is true, there's some aspect of mind which is non-local. That's true. Even if we're talking about a brain which is somehow distributed in space, our minds are not located only in your head, that's for sure. So now we get to apparitions. So again, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because there's way too much to talk about. Apparitions can be of the living or of the dead. So the apparitions of the living is you thought you saw Bob walking by, and Bob's not there. Bob's somewhere else. So sometimes known as bilocation, and there's many stories, especially among the yogis, they're being seen one place, but other people know that they're not there. So it's an apparition of the living. There are lots and lots of stories of apparitions of the dead. The most typical one is somebody dies, and 3 o'clock in the morning, grandma's at the end of the bed, and she's saying goodbye to you. That happens a lot. Crisis states are somebody who's had a very bad accident or may not be dying, but has had a bad accident and appears to the people that they love and is telling them that it's okay, I'm all right. And then days later they find out that, in fact, there was an accident at that time. And then there's a big class of Marian apparitions, the sightings of the Virgin Mary. And these things then tend to become places like Fatima and Lourdes and Medjugorje and Zaytun in Egypt. Of course, the last two are still active in the sense that people report weird things at these places. They almost always end up being places for healing, but not always. Then there's another class of induced after-death experiences. I don't know if I want to show that clip because it's an interesting concept. It's the idea of using eye motion desensitization to induce an experience of an apparition, essentially, or at least a feeling of an apparition, and it is reportedly very successful, especially for grief counseling. It gives people the sense that they are really connected with the person that they need to connect to, and it relieves their grief, like instantly. And I do have a clip, but for time's sake, I'm not sure I'll go into it. The caption is, apparently Philip and his imaginary playmate are more or less the same weight and size. Sometimes the imaginary playmates may be imaginary and maybe not. Children are much more open to these kinds of phenomena, and maybe they really are seeing something. I'm going to skip over that. Another one, just his body remains, his spirit has moved on to HBO. I'm not sure if that's an apparition, but I thought it was funny. So on haunts, the classic haunt is the haunted house. Something probably bad happened in the haunted house, and people go there and they experience it. There's a lot of expectation bias that goes on here. If you go into a house that looks like that, giving everything you know about hauntings, I guarantee you will see stuff and feel stuff that is creepy. It always happens. One of the best sources of information on good hauntings, good haunting cases by Lloyd Auerbach, his book on a paranormal case book, in which he talks about cases where he's going in with a scientific frame of mind and interviewing people and using equipment and so on. Not quite like amateur ghost busting, a couple of levels above that, in my view. And I've done similar investigations in haunted bars and haunted houses and haunted castles, and most of the time you see nothing and you record nothing. Nothing happens. And the ratio is about 1,000 hours to 1 hour of something interesting. So there's a lot of time spent out there in the middle of the night doing nothing, basically. It might help to get drunk, I think. So there's a classic haunt. And some of the haunt cases are good. I won't go through them. There's cases of poltergeist activity. Again, there's a number. Most of them are probably fake. Somebody's doing something and acting out, but not all. Some of them are real cases where real things start flying around and there's no apparent reason for that to happen. So in a poltergeist case, I would recommend this book by Bill Roll called Unleashed, which is the case of Tina Resch. This was in Columbus, Ohio, a number of years ago, where a young girl claimed that things were being thrown at her and there was stuff happening. As in many poltergeist cases, this was a disturbed adolescent. She was looking for attention. She did fake it sometimes, but not always. So she was then studied in a laboratory, and weird things happened in the lab, even under controlled conditions. And this is one of the problems when you're dealing with any kind of case study. Some of it is real and some of it is faked. So if you're coming at this from a skeptical perspective, you say, well, if it's ever faked, we can't rely on any of the information. So we'll just dismiss it all. If you're coming at it from a less skeptical perspective, but still one with discernment, you can find that sometimes we don't see any viable explanation for this other than it's a real poltergeist, without saying we know what a poltergeist is. Classically, it was spirits, noisy spirits. That's what it means. It may also be that sometimes people in an emotional state have very strong psychokinetic abilities and can make things happen, just like Dave is doing to our projector. There's this other case of the old hag phenomenon, which is reported. And this book is by David Hufford, The Terror That Comes in the Night. This is a case where somebody is sleeping and they wake up and they feel a pressure on their chest. And if they're able to open their eyes, they open it and they see something like an old hag. Usually it's a demon of some type sitting on their chest. And they see it, they feel it palpably, they can hear it, smell it, it's there. And when the thing leaves, then the pressure leaves. So from a classical perspective, meaning a neuroscience perspective, this is sleep paralysis, which happens to some people. You wake up and you can't move and you get scared. But it doesn't account for all of the other phenomena associated with this particular type of apparition. This is an apparition which has been seen probably for thousands of years and is experienced in the same way by people in different cultures. Something is sitting on my chest and I don't want it to be there. And usually it doesn't look so good. So Hufford is a psychiatrist, and he gives a really good overview of the nature of the phenomena throughout history and his assessment of the evidence, which says that it is a real phenomenon. It's not just sleep paralysis or hallucination. And by the way, it's because of this kind of thing that the hauntings and a lot of apparitions are associated with negative affect and negative effects as well. People don't like these things to be real. I mean, I don't like the idea that there are old hags out there that want to sit on me either, but in fact it may be true. And so the more open you are psychically, the more likely you are to experience something like that, and it's real. Yeah.
There are also some people report very positive experiences with hypnagogic hallucinations, with beautiful images of butterflies or angels or things like that.
Right, and then there's also a long history of the incubus and the succubus, which are much better than the old hag, because they're not just lying on your chest, they're doing other things. So, yeah, there's a history of many kinds of entities, for want of a better word, that interact with us, almost always at night. So we're already in altered states. That somewhere around 3 o'clock in the morning is when your hormones are just right, and your ordinary frame of thinking is not there. Most people become more sensitive to these things. Physical mediumship. Probably the most famous case is Holmes, who apparently was able to do things as dramatic as levitation. The interesting case about Holmes is he performed and did these amazing things for something like 30 years and was never caught cheating. Because the implication is that if somebody can actually do that in front of multiple witnesses, and in this case, levitate outside one window and come around through in the other window, even if that was a magic trick, that's pretty good. Nobody knows how to do that today, and this was not in his house. It was in somebody else's house. So there are a couple of cases like Holmes that have not been explained very well. Another one is the independent voice phenomena. This is the case where a physical mediumship would have something like a trumpet, and voices would come out of the trumpet that were relevant to what people wanted to hear. This happens to be a fake one, because there were a lot of fake mediums too. This medium had a radio inside the trumpet. And in fact, one of the reasons why all the physical mediumship has pretty much gone away, except in cases of performances, is because of people like Houdini and others and William James, who investigated lots and lots of physical mediums and found that more often than not they were faking. Table tipping. So table tipping is interesting because there's still people who do that today. It used to be very popular as a parlor trick in the 1800s. But there are people who do it today and swear up and down that they get the same phenomenon. So I happened to be talking to a lady at work the other day who said that she used to do this with her daughter, and they would get the table standing up and they'd have to chase it around the room. So when we get back to IONS, we'll do an experiment with her because she seems to be the important person. If other people are involved, it doesn't happen. So she might be a physical medium without knowing it, and it manifests in her case by this table tipping. So I'd love to get that in the laboratory because we can instrument the wazoo out of it and figure out what's actually going on. Hector Plasm. There's a good 10-hour talk on the nature of what's going on here. So supposedly it's an extrusion of some sort of spiritual material out of every orifice, and usually in women mediums, that would sometimes take on the appearance of a hand or something else which is recognizable like a person's face. In the fake cases, it's gauze. It's literally fabric. In the few cases that look like it's real, we don't have any idea what it is. but it's kind of slimy. Spirit photography has been around a very long time. The modern version of that, I would say, is orbs. The globes of light that appear when people take pictures with digital photography. Some cases are real. This is a fake case. It was probably the day after somebody developed the idea of doing photography, they developed the idea of doing double exposure. So there's a lot of fraudulent cases. But again, there are a few cases where it's pretty clear because of experiments that it wasn't faked. And those are more interesting, of course. Electronic voice phenomena and instrumental transcommunication. They're audio, video, computers, spirit faces. This is an interesting quote from Edison. I am inclined to believe that our personality hereafter will be able to affect matter. If we can evolve an instrument so delicate as to be affected by our personality as it survives in the next life, such an instrument ought to record something. So there are plenty of cases around of this kind of thing. This is an example of using instrumental transcommunication with video feedback, from which people claim to see things. There's a case of what is supposedly a lady's face that shows up. Here's her eyes and her nose in one of these sessions. This is Mark Macy's work on spirit faces, where he takes a Polaroid picture of you, and sometimes another face appears, and the other face he claims is a departed loved one. I've been present when Mark has done his demonstrations, and I'm not too impressed with it because it's a handheld Polaroid camera without a flash. And so it could just as easily be a movement. In fact, almost all of these pictures look like there's a little bit of movement. So if I were going to do this, I would do it at least with the cameras on a tripod so it doesn't move. If you then get this, then there's something to write home about. So here's some examples of EVP. This was part of an experiment done by at this website, you see at the bottom, the American Association for Electronic Voice Phenomena. So that was 3 examples of the same thing. Just repeat it. I'll do one more time. And this then was used in an experiment to see if people could understand what was being said. And they, can you understand what's being said? We keep looking for peace. That's supposedly what people heard. And here's another example. This one's a little easier to understand, I think. If it comes up. No, this was the one where they're being silent. Oops. Well, this worked yesterday. Anyway, it does kind of sound like thanks for the money. Now, what spirits are doing with money, I don't know. Maybe that's where part of our $1 trillion bailouts go. So the interesting thing about this, and maybe Julie and Mark will say more about it as well, that here's a phenomena that you can test. So you put on a radio and it's playing and you're picking up spirit voices. And the question is, are we projecting our meaning into those voices or there's something actually there? So there have been a few experiments of this type. They show kind of interesting results, but I would say that the jury is still out. NDEs. Raymond Moody is probably best known for popularizing this idea of a near-death experience. And the raccoon says, then they looked up, and just like they say, there was this beautiful bright light. Actually, 2 near roadkill experiences. So the near-death experience, the experience itself usually has elements of the person knows that they're dead. There's a sense of calmness and serenity, or sometimes intense bliss or love. They have an out-of-body experience. They move upward through a bright tunnel. They encounter a being or beings of light. They get a life review. They reach a border or a boundary where they know that if they go beyond that, then they can't come back. Sometimes you see a landscape that looks like a spiritual realm or a world.